Very significant moment on the world stage. President Biden met with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky during this unannounced trip. It comes just days before the one-year mark of Russia's brutal invasion of Ukraine. This moment is highly significant this morning. Biden sending a strong message of support to Ukrainians as air raid sirens wailed across Kyiv, underscoring the very real risk involved in this trip. Both leaders spoke a moment ago about the weight of this historic moment.
President Biden, that is so important signal for us, and we are proud of it. Thank you very much for coming, Mr. President.
It's good to be back in Kyiv. I was telling the President, one of my newer staff members on the flight from Washington in Poland asked me how many times I've been to Kyiv. And I had to stop and think, it's my 8th trip. And much has changed. Much of it bad with the invasion, but also the Ukrainian people have stepped up in a way that few people ever have in their own defense, and have apparently also embraced the notions of democracy. No longer discussions about whether or not certain privileged people have control.
We have CNN coverage from all fronts this morning. Phil Mattingly is here with me in Warsaw. Clarissa Ward is standing by on the ground in Kyiv. Fred Pleitgen is in Moscow, and Kylie Atwood is at the State Department. Of course, this is a historic visit by President Biden. It is actually his 8th visit to Ukraine, his first, though, since Russia invaded. It's a visit that he has said he has wanted to make since 11 months ago, but now, of course, President Biden has finally made it under a shroud of secrecy. Clarissa Ward knows that well. She was watching this entire visit happen before it could actually be reported, Clarissa, that President Biden was there on the ground in Kyiv. What could you see from your vantage?
So, Caitlin, we're now here in the square where President Biden was. He was inside St. Michael's Church just behind me, and you could hear those air raid sirens start wailing. There was a moment where everybody was wondering whether he was actually going to come out of the church. He and President Zelensky came out of the church. They met up with 2 soldiers who were carrying wreaths, and then they proceeded to kind of march over to this area where you can see several wreaths. You can also see a lot of television cameras. Of course, this is a huge news story here in Ukraine. And you can see behind me, just there next to that reporter, this is the U.S. wreath that was laid as President Zelensky and President Biden looked on. The 2 leaders then embraced. The air raid sirens finally stopped wailing, and President Biden got into his motorcade. And I should say it was an extraordinarily huge motorcade. This entire area was completely blocked off to traffic. The streets were empty. Our live shot position is up on the balcony of the hotel behind me, and we had multiple visits from soldiers who told us under no circumstances were we to go out on the balcony. At one stage, they came up even to tell us to stand back further from the window. So there was a lot of security that went into this. This is a trip that many people have been waiting a long time for. And as you heard from President Zelensky talking about how meaningful this was, Caitlin, what a strong signal of support. And that is something we're hearing reflected again and again, talking to ordinary Ukrainians. We needed this right now, and we greatly appreciate it.
Yeah, and there's actual support that they are sending as well. Clarissa, what a remarkable moment, though, was as President Biden and President Zelensky were walking into the church, I believe, that's behind you, air raid sirens were actually going off in Kyiv as President Biden was on the ground, right?
And it's interesting because, you know, the expectation had been that with the president here, it might be a quiet day. The Russians almost certainly already knew he was here. They'd be unlikely to do something like, extraordinary, like launching a missile attack on this city while the president was here. But when we heard those air raid sirens, the first thing you want to find out is what type of threat has been reported. In this case, it was MiG activity over Belarus. That, again, is something that we have on an almost daily basis, but it does take on pretty loaded significance when you have the president of the United States in a church in the center of town, still miles away from the next border being Poland, where we presume, obviously, he is on his way to now. So it was definitely a tense moment, although you didn't see that necessarily reflected on the ground. I will say that when we were watching the movements of people who were accompanying President Biden and President Zelensky, were very fast, a lot of running. This whole part of the puzzle only took 10 minutes. It was 5 minutes in the church. The air raid started wailing, 5 minutes here on the ground, laying the wreath, and then very quickly, President Biden was gone again.
Yeah, and just a very small contingent with him. Typically, he travels with so many staffers with him, Clarissa. But also, Phil Mattingly is live here in Warsaw, where President Biden is headed after this. It was actually what was supposed to be the first stop on his schedule, Phil. But of course, the White House had this secret trip that they had been planning. You know, we had not seen President Biden since he was out in Washington on Saturday night, and then he reappeared in Kyiv at about 8 o'clock local this morning. What more do you know about the planning, Phil, that went into this secret visit of President Biden's?
Okay, then there are a lot of details that are still not yet public by design for security reasons. But we do know that top Biden advisors have been talking for several months about how to best symbolize this moment. They really were looking at the one-year anniversary, the one-year commemoration, I guess, of the Russian invasion, and wanted to ensure that they had maximum impact in terms of the president's efforts up to this point, not just from the U.S. support side, but the durability of the international coalition they put together, in part because they knew that there was no clear end game coming anytime soon. That was why they saw this as such a significant moment. Now, in terms of the trip itself, as you noted, the last time we saw the president was on Saturday night. He was out to dinner with the First Lady. We did not see him again until the video that you guys have been showing. What happened in between, besides the White House putting out a public schedule that did not have this trip on it whatsoever, was the actual trip going underway. At 4 a.m., around 4:15 a.m. on Sunday, Air Force One departed Andrews Air Force Base. There was no notice. Reporters that were on the trip had to give their devices to staff before they departed. The next time reporters were able to talk, the pool was able to give a timeline, was 8 a.m. was when they arrived in this area. By 8:30, he was at the palace to meet with President Zelensky, the First Lady as well. He was joined, as you noted, by just a small contingent of staffers, National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, Deputy Chief of Staff Jen O'Malley Dillon, Ambassador Bridget Brink, and the Deputy Ambassador as well, for their meetings. And again, it's important to note this wasn't just a symbolic photo, a moment for pictures and cameras. They also did have a bilateral sit-down between the two presidents and their top advisors to discuss kind of the current state of play. Also, President Zelensky saying they were discussing defense assistance, of which the president and President Zelensky and his team continued to ask for more and faster, as U.S. officials are quite aware of at this point in time. But I think more importantly, as you look, and Caitlin, you know this as well as anybody, what the president said about the importance of this, showing that there is no doubt, that there should be no doubt about the U.S. Support, about the durability of that support, and about the support of the Western alliance that has been there since day one, I think was so critical. And then one last thing I would say is that, you know, the president referencing the phone call he had with President Zelensky on the night of the invasion, a moment where even top administration officials, top Biden advisors weren't sure that President Zelensky would be president that much longer. They weren't sure Kyiv would be standing that much longer. Now, 361 days later, not only is President Zelensky still there, not only is Kyiv still standing, but President Biden was standing in Kyiv with him.